Good morning, friends. In Sunday's message, we use the illustration of temptation to demonstrate that a person can be frustrated but remain sinless provided they respond to that frustration in a righteous manner. Because even when it comes to just straight up temptation, the sin comes in the response to the temptation, not simply in the fact that you've been tempted in the first place. Because once again, the scriptures are very clear, according to Hebrews, that Jesus was tempted in every respect as we are, yet without sin. And so we talked about temptation in this regard as an illustration to help us understand how Jesus could therefore be frustrated without sinning. But today, I'd like to go back to the idea of temptation and sin itself and the relationship between those to examine them more thoroughly. And to help us to do that, let's go to James chapter 1, verse 12 and following, where we read, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." Now, before we continue, because there's more to come, but let's make sure we understand some of the foundational truths that James has already introduced us to. First, as we know, and as is clearly told here, as God's people, we are going to undergo trials. It's just a matter of course for the follower of Christ. And of course, we are called to remain steadfast, to have that faith like a mustard seed, faith that perhaps starts off small, but endures and perseveres and grows in the strength of the Lord. And if we remain steadfast, we know there's the reward of the crown of life awaiting for us, and praise the Lord for that. But then we have the instruction that let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. Now, where did that come from? Well, James is talking about trials, right? He's talking about Christians enduring and remaining steadfast during trials. And there are all sorts of trials. As James says at the beginning of the chapter, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Because we often default to thinking about these sorts of trials, these times of sufferings, as relating specifically to being persecuted by the world for the sake of Christ. And of course, that persecution would certainly be included in the kinds of trials that we can have. But so is the trial, the hardship, the occasion of suffering that is temptation. Because each point at which we are tempted to sin is a self-contained trial in and of itself. And often enough, when we resist that temptation, we suffer in some way for the sake of it. Think of it like a smoker who is determined to quit smoking. The desire is there. The temptation to smoke is there. There is both a physical and an emotional longing to smoke. And it hurts in many ways to deny yourself the satisfaction of having that smoke. In the same way, it is the same way when it comes to sin, because in our old natures, we are addicted to sin. In the person we used to be, we loved our sin. And that old nature, that old person is still trying to hold on to us. And so the simple act of resisting temptation can cause a certain amount of spiritual and emotional and perhaps even physical suffering. But we must endure. We must remain steadfast as we go through that trial because the crown of life awaits. And so temptation itself can be the trial that we need to overcome, which is why James says, let no one say when he's tempted, I am being tempted by God. Because we know that God is sovereign and we know that God tests his people through the course of his discipline of them. And of course, when I say his discipline of them, I don't mean that God just goes around punishing his people for no reason, but that he disciplines us in terms of us being his disciples. So we could say he disciplines us, but we could also say he disciples us through discipline. He disciplines us in terms of training us, even as an athletics coach teaches and is instrumental in the players disciplining their bodies to be able to compete. But while God tests us in various ways as part of that discipline, he never tempts us. And sometimes we are inclined to think that God does tempt us by the situations that come our way, but he does not, because tempting and testing, while related, are quite different in one very important way. Properly understood, properly given, a test is given in the hopes that the test taker will succeed. But a temptation is given in the hopes that the one tempted will fail. So God tests, but he does not tempt. He disciplines us, he trains us, and he does so to build us up. He does not tempt, because temptation is done for the purpose of breaking a person down. And doing such a thing, as James points out, is completely contrary to God's nature. He is the God of life. He does not tempt people to sin, because that leads to death. So James goes on and explains, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So there's again that clear link between sin and death we just mentioned. But let's consider the part that came just before that. How do temptations arise in the first place? We're told when we are lured and enticed by our own desires. Now again, let me clarify, or be careful to clarify, that while temptations are often enticed by desires that are already sinful, that's not always the case. For example, as an obvious example that is rampant in our world today, if a man cheats on his wife, commits adultery, that adultery obviously would have never happened if he did not already have sinful desires in his heart regarding women that weren't his wife. So sin begets sin in this case. But even then, if you go back to the very beginning of that string of desires, if that makes any sense, hopefully we can clarify in a minute. But if you go very back to the beginning of that string of desires, at some point you get back to a basic desire for intimacy and even pleasure. And you know what? That basic desire for intimacy and physical pleasure is not sinful. God created us as sexual beings who, generally speaking, do have such desires according to the nature that God gave us when he created us. The desire for intimacy, relational intimacy, and physical pleasure did not start when the sinful nature entered the picture in the fall. But it's when that original desire presents itself and then we choose to satisfy it in a way that is contrary to God's purpose for it, that's when the problem comes. God made us sexual creatures, though he did give the gift of celibacy and singleness to some, but generally speaking, God made humans sexual creatures that such desires could have their fulfillment in the covenant bond of marriage. And in that context, it is not only incredibly pleasing to the man and woman involved, but it is glorifying to God and it serves his purposes. But the point I'm trying to make is that a desire that is in its intended form innocent and righteous can indeed give rise to temptation. Temptation to satisfy that desire in a way that is contrary to its God-given purpose. Because in verse 15, when James writes, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, well, at that point, of course, the desire is there. And then the desire meets a certain situation, a certain opportunity where a choice needs to be made. Do I satisfy this desire, which in and of itself is not wrong, but do I satisfy that desire in a way that God intended it to be satisfied, or do I satisfy it in a contrary way, a sinful way? And my understanding is that when James writes that the desire conceives and gives birth to sin, that's when the temptation has failed. That's when we choose to satisfy the desire in a way that is sinful, which then brings the actual sin. Now, again, if we're already sinning because, to stick with the illustration at hand, we're already lusting after a particular woman who's not our wife, and then the temptation comes to actually sleep with her, well, yeah, that's one sin leading to another sin. But consider this. If you're just driving down the street and you see a woman walking on a sidewalk, and I know that this is generally for the men, but women, please transpose, for your own situation. But, for you men, you're driving down the street and you see a woman walking on the sidewalk and she catches your eye as particularly attractive. Well, yes, there is that base desire to enjoy physical intimacy, and men are very visual in that. But provided you weren't looking for that as you were driving along, you weren't hoping to, feast your eyes on people as they were walking along, in that case, that basic desire, which in and of itself is not wrong, but that basic desire is there. And now the temptation presents itself. Do you feast your eyes? Or, having registered her presence, Having realized that looking at her is something that can quickly lead you into sin, do you look away? Do you perhaps even put your hand up alongside your face so that you can see the road, but your peripheral vision is blocked in her direction? Because in both those cases, temptation was presented. In the response of feasting your eyes, that original desire conceived and gave birth to sin. If you look away, however, by God's grace, you restrain your desire, requiring it to remain in a context that is still glorifying to God rather than satisfying it in a sinful way, then you remain innocent, even though you were genuinely tempted in that moment. But you do not permit that desire to conceive in that way and give birth to sin. I don't want any men out there struggling with sexual sin, wanting to be pure. I don't want you driving down the road, you see that woman, you put your hand up to block her from your vision, and then as you drive past, you're saying, Lord, keep me pure, Lord, keep me pure, Lord, keep me pure, until you know that you're well past her. I don't want you feeling guilty that you had to put your hand up. No, that was righteousness. You were tempted because the enemy in our own sinful nature will use even a good basic desire to turn it to sin. You were tempted, but you did not sin. You overcame it by doing what was required in that moment to not indulge the desire in a sinful way. And so this is how we need to understand temptation. And as we saw in that last case, temptation requires swift action on our parts to avoid sin. But be encouraged. Again, if you were in that situation, you saw the woman, you put up your hand, you did not sin. Was there temptation? Yes. Was there sin? No. By his grace and in his strength, that temptation was defeated and you didn't sin. Rather, you acted in righteousness in a way that was pleasing to the Lord and glorifying to his name. So, no, don't take temptation lightly, but also understand that you have not sinned simply because temptation presented itself. Rather, overcome that temptation through the power of Christ and rejoice that he kept you righteous. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.